of social work and action. Her two recent books are Going Green and Social Work Response to Environment and Disasters. Professor Agnimitra has also been contributing to grassroots action in the domain of community development, gender work, health, environmental action, and disaster management for the past 30 years. Professor Agnimitra is also a member secretary of Community Development Cell and the nodal person for the Unnat Bharat Abhiyan and Ek Bharat Shresht Bharat initiatives of University of Delhi. She is a part of many core committees of university. She is a visiting faculty and member of board of research studies for reputed institutions of higher learning. I welcome you, ma'am. And she will be throwing light upon issues of COVID-19 lockdown and the vulnerable population and its impact.
So once again, hearty welcome to you, ma'am. The session is over to you. Just a minute. I request the participants to keep your mics and cameras off, switched off, and also refrain from sending messages. You can send messages at the time of interactive session. Please refrain from sending messages. Thank you. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Nandini. Is my audio clear?
Yes.
So a very good afternoon to the faculty, students and scholars of Government First Grade College, KR Nagar. Also, many congratulations to the college team, the Department of Social Work and the team for organizing the first webinar. I do hope, all my best wishes, that this should be maybe first one in a long series of webinars and other enriching fora that you organize for your students and for the other guests. Today, I have been asked to speak on vulnerability in the context of the COVID lockdown and the ongoing, continuing COVID crisis. At the outset, let me just share that I'm not using a PowerPoint presentation because, having been socialized as a teacher, I always believe in looking into the eyes of the audience. Here, I can't look into your eyes, but perhaps you can look into mine and get a grasp of what I'm trying to say. So if I was to begin, I'm sure so much has been written on the COVID crisis that I think all of us are satiated in terms of information that we have on the various dimensions of the crisis. I think right from the 11th of March 2020, when the World Health Organization announced that the COVID-19 was a global first for this novel species called the coronavirus. I think since then we have all been only, kind of living, the time in the context of the coronavirus. It has, I'm sure, been a very daunting, it still is a very daunting, a very horrific, and a very unprecedented reality of all our lives. And, we did have a bookish knowledge about what a pandemic is because I come from a disaster background also. But experiencing a pandemic is a different cup of tea altogether and something that we would not like to repeat ever in our lives. A pandemic that is so completely global. It is, the definition of pandemic is that it affects more than one nation, but a pandemic which is global, again, is unprecedented, unheard of. Whether it is the countries of the global north or the global south, it has spared none. Even in our wildest stretch of imagination, we could not have anticipated the monumental dimensions and the ongoing and long-term implications that COVID or coronavirus or this crisis would have on our lives. I'm sure we all agree that it has led to a sheer existential crisis for humanity, and this seems to be the first time. We have come to live in a phase which is very different from the pre-corona or the pre-COVID times, because this crisis is like a frontal attack on our erstwhile neoliberal existential patterns, which were characterized by what? Which were characterized by hypermobility, footlooseness, instant connectivity, suddenly the world has almost stopped flowing. The flow of the world has stopped. That seamlessness, the very easy movement of people, money, goods, all of that has come to a complete standstill. If some of us know a little bit of physics, it's like that we have moved on from an inertia of very rapid motion to an inertia of complete rest. I like it when some people say that, it is almost as if the planet has shut down to reboot itself, and we are waiting for it to reboot itself. I also, many times, I don't like the term the new normal, because I'm sure none of us are comfortable with this new normal. I persist in calling it abnormal times. And I'm sure all of us hope that we go back to the erstwhile normal times as soon as possible. The only thing that seems to be flowing in this standstill world is the virus and the infection. And we are all familiar how rapidly, it continues to infest newer and newer constituents. So there is an ethos of fear, there is an ethos of trauma, trust deficit, extreme insecurity, stress and distress, hypervigilance. We are all hypervigilant these days. There's a sense of dysfunction, and to top it all, there's a sense of ongoing uncertainty about the near and the distant future. The present crisis is also compounded by the other, natural and man-made calamities that are occurring simultaneously. We all know that the threat of earthquakes is very real. We also have had the occurrence of cyclones, Amphan and Nisarga on our coasts. And we are also a little, edgy with the standoffs that we are having on our borders. So all of that is presenting a very worrisome frame for all of us. So very briefly, this sums up the present context in which we are located today. Now, coming to the whole idea of vulnerability, which is the theme of the webinar, it is worth reflecting as to what is vulnerability, who are vulnerable, who are more vulnerable. So what does it mean to be vulnerable? You all know that, vulnerability, although we talk about vulnerability, but vulnerability as a context has emanated largely from disasters and disaster management, the context of disasters. But because till date, our focus has not been on pandemics as a disaster, not much is known about pandemics within the categories of disasters. Much of what we are experiencing is very new. It is undocumented. We don't have any prior experiences or insights which can, give us some basis as to how to determine vulnerability, how to look at vulnerability, and how to deal with vulnerability. Very succinctly speaking, vulnerable groups of people are those who are disproportionately exposed to risk in any exposure to a hazard. So how do we look at vulnerability in the context of COVID? The COVID pandemic has largely, it has changed the definition, perception, and canvas of vulnerability. As far as the physical vulnerability is concerned, we all know that this virus is very virulent. It can be easily transmitted. And as a result, each member of the global population is vulnerable to infestation by this virus and to its correlates in terms of morbidity and mortality. We have also seen how medical research is throwing up newer and newer facts about physiological vulnerability. Initially, the young persons were projected to be least vulnerable, but later data has shown that they are also vulnerable. In the context of the pandemic achieving a community spread, vulnerability to exposure and its subsequent impact is definitely community-wide. But within this generalized context of the large-scale vulnerability, there are certain core pre-existing and chronic vulnerabilities which have been experienced by specific groups, which have led to differential vulnerabilities and impact burdens for different groups. The impacts of this crisis are being and shall be borne differently and disproportionately by certain sections of the population. For example, We know for certain that the strategies that are most recommended for controlling the spread of COVID 19 are self distancing and frequent hand washing. They do reduce the risk of infection, but we also know that these are not easy to attain for the millions of people who live in high density communities with precarious or insecure housing and poor sanitation and little or no access to clean water. Often, people living in these settings also have malnutrition, non communicable diseases, and infectious diseases such as HIV, AIDS, and tuberculosis to compound the crisis. We also know that people from the low socioeconomic backgrounds and those who work in casual employment, they are unlikely to have the necessary financial resources to make self-distancing and self-isolation, a viable option within the context of their daily livelihoods. We also know that access to quality health services, including basic primary healthcare, can most certainly save lives. But we also know that the same is highly incommensurate, or it is contingent on user pays systems that already makes them inaccessible to people who are most at risk. With no social or economic safety covers like insurance, such groups definitely become more vulnerable to the worst impacts of this crisis. We also know that the elderly people, the older persons, and people with disabilities, they're not only inordinately constrained in accessing essential services, including food and health, that are required, they are also more prone to the risk of infection due to their compromised health status and comorbidities, rendering them again more disproportionately impacted. I'm sure all of us have heard and we have seen illustrations from the West where, in the initial phase, a shortage of ventilators led the healthcare personnel to save younger people. That means those who had more years to live as compared to the older ones who were left to die. We also know that the poor and the vulnerable populations do not have or may not have the necessary language and the literacy skills to understand and to appropriately respond to pandemic messaging, placing them at a higher risk of negative impact. We also know that the mental health concerns among the most vulnerable within our communities will be exacerbated by experiences and expectations to self isolate if we don't approach them sensitively. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the COVID crisis has left different groups facing differential vulnerabilities and experiencing differential impacts emanating from this crisis. We also know that for any disaster, there are no disaster specific vulnerabilities. Most of the vulnerabilities are pre existing vulnerabilities, and they are just exposed much more in a crisis context. And the same has happened even in the case of the COVID crisis. As a once in a century pandemic, COVID has exposed and it has brought center stage the very deep rooted and persistent vulnerabilities of certain intersectional, invisible sections of the Indian society, such as the migrant community, the urban homeless, residents of informal settlements, workers who deal with biomedical waste, small and marginal farmers, landless agricultural laborers, among many others. These are the people who have been silently playing a very big role in running our households and our economy. But at the same time, they have remained invisible and faceless, in that we have never paid any cognizance or much cognizance to them. The onset and the long period of lockdown and even the challenges faced by them in the recent unlockdown periods, they have intersected with their pre-existing disadvantages, bringing all of them to fore, together with their chronic inequalities, discrimination, anxieties, and fierce struggles to survive the humongous challenges imposed on them by the crisis. Let's begin with the migrant workforce. The Economic Survey of India 2017 has estimated that we have nearly 140 million migrants in India. The COVID crisis made the hitherto invisibility of this constituency of migrant workers who have been a vital link in India's economy glaringly apparent. In terms of inclusion in urban planning policies, the migrant community has been largely ignored, thereby forcing them into what I call the intersectional invisibility. The internal migrant workers comprise of workers migrated as individuals or as groups on a temporary or a seasonal basis in search of work to urban areas of other geographical regions of the country. We all know that they engage in temporary, unskilled work characterized as it is by low wages, job insecurity, and economic vulnerability, which are peculiar characteristics of any informal work environment. They are not covered by any employer social security or insurance scheme. And as such, they are regarded as the neglected workforce with very few or insufficient legislations to take care of them. We have all seen, none of us have any doubt about what they have experienced during the lockdown period and even afterwards. We have witnessed mass exodus of the migrants from their host locales to their native places on account of the fact that the grave constraints imposed on them by the national lockdown intersected with their already existing vulnerabilities, leading to a singular crisis for them. This crisis was of an unprecedented scale. Deprived of their livelihood, food security, and even shelter and daily subsistence, their struggles were heartrending, to say the least. They were ill prepared to stay back, yet unable to go back to their homes. Many of them who preferred to go back with public transport having stopped, they had to walk unimaginable distances, and many are still lingering on the way. We also know that pandemics are not just medical phenomenon. They have immense psychosocial implications affecting society at large, but particularly exacerbating the psychosocial vulnerability of the disadvantaged communities such as the migrants. Even otherwise, this group is chronically predisposed to diverse psychological consequences coming from multiple stressors. For example, they already face chronic poverty, livelihood uncertainty and instability, malnutrition, loss of their culture and religious practices, absence of social protection systems, malalignment with the new cultures where they have come to be placed, language difficulties, loss of identity, substance abuse, poor access to healthcare, in addition to poor living conditions and financial constraints. To top it, the lockdown and its associated ramifications have led to very, very high levels of anxiety in this particular constituency. And we have seen that it has induced socially irresponsible behavior and panic attacks among the migrants. An interface between their predisposing factors, we know that many of them, they have been also perceived as vectors of transmission. They also have a lot of pre-existing health and occupation related morbidities. For example, occupational pneumoconiosis, tuberculosis, HIV infections. They also have pre-existing psychological morbidities, adverse psychosocial factors like absence of family support, absence of support systems, absence of caretakers during crisis, limitations of following guidelines pertaining to personal safety, social exclusion, inability to access psychiatric services. All of these have given a lot of psychological distress to this constituency of the migrant workers. Added to this, they also face the financial constraints, making this occupational group highly vulnerable for psychological distress. Then we have the category of the urban homeless. It is again estimated that almost 30% of the urban people who live in informal settlements, formerly called slums, their condition is just a shade better than the homeless because they also suffer from most vulnerabilities which the homeless constituencies suffer from, including severe health issues. This close to 1 billion people who are estimated to be living in the slums or informal settlements are again highly susceptible to the COVID infection, since basic needs such as water, toilets, drainage, waste collection, and secure and adequate housing are already in short supply or non existent for them. Further, space constraints, overcrowding in slums and tenements make physical distancing and self quarantine impractical, and the rapid spread of an infection is highly likely. Pre existing comorbidities are also likely to increase their vulnerability to the infection. We all, all of us are privy to the occurrence of the COVID infection and the rapid transmission of COVID infection in the overcrowded communities in the slum areas of urban cities like Dharavi or the underprivileged localities of metro cities like Delhi. While rapid structural responses such as lockdowns, curfews, physical distancing protocols, and travel restrictions, they have greatly curtailed the spread of the virus and they have saved life. Definitely, they have placed a lot of constraints on these disadvantaged sections in even meeting their basic needs. While the government and the civil society has responded by providing financial support and food security to ease these pressures, the demand is so overwhelmingly huge, and it is also expected to continue for a seemingly long time, highlighting a very long-term vulnerability of these sections of our population. Residents of informal settlements are also economically vulnerable. We all know that because most of them are informal workers and they have to step out to earn their daily wages. Again, the migrant workers and the urban landless, they form a majority of those who do menial jobs in cities, including the frontline sanitary works of the local bodies. Many of them are Dalits, which is a secondary intersectional burden that they carry. Many from the informal settlements have continued to engage in essential services such as sweeping and segregating and disposing waste without protective gear. The high rate of risk that these workers will get infected has been selectively ignored by many of us. Definitely, if they were to choose, they would choose financial survival in their compelling trade off with physical health. We are also experiencing, what we call the discernible problem of gatedness and stigma. Gatedness has a new medical legitimacy. For all those of us who belong to the middle classes and the upper middle classes, there is now medical legitimacy that we have to gate ourselves off and away from the others. And that others largely comprises of the disadvantaged and the vulnerable and the marginalized sections of society. Um, the ongoing stigma that we are tending to perceive and manifest on the members of the impoverished and marginalized communities, because we are perceiving them, most of us, even the educated ones, we perceive them as vectors for the spread of infection. And we very well know where the infection came from. It was rather, the population, the upper middle class population, which had traveled abroad, which were the initial, transmitters of the coronavirus. And all of this, the stigma and the gatedness that they feel also definitely is enhancing, will enhance the psychosocial vulnerability of these categories. Now we are, as frontline workers, we are tending to focus a lot on the doctors and nurses, and definitely we are very, very grateful to these heroes and, who have, given us so much of protection and they have served selflessly. But what about the other heroic workers who work in hospitals and clinics? Most members of this workforce, like the ward boys and the other staff who collect human waste, clean up post-surgical patients, remove infectious biomedical waste, they have not even been trained. They don't even know about the risks associated with such wastes, even when they are engaged in removing the waste of infected patients, the waste of symptomatic and asymptomatic carriers, positive patients under treatment, and of course, in the movement of the mortal remains of patients who die of infection, also the mortuary or the morgue workers. Then we come to another category, the marginal farmers and agricultural laborers. They have lost their livelihood as the lockdown has brought the entire farm activities and agricultural supply chain to a standstill. The landowners are on the brink of a financial breakdown as flowers, fruits, vegetables, and more critically, the rabi crops remain unharvested. Though the government has exempted certain categories from lockdown, but the farming sector is facing an acute dearth of laborers who have either left for homes or they have chosen to remain at home. Apart from these very discernible sections of population, there are others who, from a gradient of socio-economic groups, are struggling to cope physically, mentally, financially, and psychologically with the COVID crisis. They include the older people, those with ill health and with comorbidities, children, adolescents, women, transgender people, commercial sex workers, and many others. We all know the vulnerability of the elderly population to the COVID crisis. We all know that the last census showed that almost 10% of India's population is above 60 years. And so in the event of community transmission, about 104 million older adults have been at a high risk of infection. And about half of these individuals are a part of the lowest income group, making them still more vulnerable. Experience across the globe tells us that the older adults with pre-existing health conditions are at a risk of facing serious illness and even death during the COVID crisis. Experts have observed that older patients need longer hospital stays due to delayed recovery, faster progression of the illness, and eventually increased mortality. Apart from physiological vulnerability, the older persons also face immense psychosocial challenges. Their pre-existing and multi-layered vulnerabilities have only multiplied in the new normal times. Many of them are severely constrained in accessing domestic help, caregiving, and critical health services. In the context of social distancing and self-isolation, many of them are experiencing mental health issues arising from loneliness, chronic fear, stress, anxiety, and fear of death of self and loved ones. The effect of the COVID crisis on children is also an area of major concern. Thankfully, children have been largely spared from severe symptomatic reactions, which are more common among adults, at least till date. However, for children to tragically lose a parent, a family member, or a caregiver to the COVID infection leads to a very significant psychosocial impact. According to the UN policy brief on the impact of COVID on children, physical distancing and lockdown are all affecting children in multiple ways. Face-to-face child services like schooling, nutrition programs, maternal and newborn care, immunization services, sexual and reproductive health services, HIV treatment, alternative care facilities, and case management for children requiring supplementary personalized care. For example, children living with disabilities or abuse victims, they have been partially or completely suspended due to the crisis. The pandemic is also having profound effects on children's mental well-being, their social development, their safety, their privacy, their economic security. Due to the lockdown, children are temporarily out of the school system. The impact is more far-reaching than just a loss of education, which there is definitely. In a country like India, where school food programs benefit millions of children, and these programs constitute one of the most reliable daily sources of food for children of low-income families, this huge benefit has been curtailed in the present time. Thus, impacts are expected to be very, very damaging for children in the poorest countries, in the poorest neighborhoods, and for those who are already disadvantaged or vulnerable. The pandemic also has a gendered vulnerability, and we all know that. Again, male mortality has been higher than female mortality, but it doesn't take away anything from the women's pre-existing and newer vulnerabilities. The socio-economic and the psychological impact is disproportionately high for women and girls. Again, as I have said again and again, that the pandemic is deepening the pre-existing inequalities. Similarly, women and girls are more predisposed, more vulnerable simply by virtue of their sex. Even here, the women do not constitute a homogeneous constituency. Poor women, pregnant women, migrant women, women with disability, and others, they are more vulnerable to the COVID crisis. Many studies are showing that lockdowns are increasing the marginalization of women of almost all constituencies, but particularly poor women. Domestic violence, sexual violence, gender-based violence have increased. They tend to increase during any crisis situation. Under conditions of quarantine or stay-at-home measures, women and children who live with violent and controlling men are exposed to considerably greater danger. Family violence, we all know that there are multiple types of family violence. They may be physical, sexual, psychological, or even economic, and they can include child abuse and intimate partner violence. The work burdens of women go up tremendously as families stay home. Working women face a double whammy as they not only have to undertake work from home, but they also have to multitask with all the other enhanced home and family responsibilities. We also know that they are the most important caregivers. So in case of infections and disease, they also have to perform these tasks without choice and without remuneration. Again, it's very important for us to note that most of the front line workers, in the context of the crisis are women, because women make 70% of all health and social services staff globally. And apart from their primary responsibility of household work, when they undertake these frontline tasks, their exposure to the infection is much more. Women also account for a majority of the world's older population, particularly those over 80 years. And thus, a majority of the potential patients also comprise of women. They are vulnerable economically also because their finances are weaker than men and their position in the job market is precarious and less secure. I'll just cover a couple of constituencies very briefly because these are also very important for us to cover. Let's look at the transgender people. The lockdown has left the transgender people at a heightened risk of hunger and poverty, since most of them make their living on streets, by begging or by street entertainment or by paid sex. They are not socially privileged to operate, as we are in the online world, as they are predominantly dependent on social interactions and functions such as weddings or baby showers. Transgender people are, as it is a socially marginalized community, live in slums where social distance is challenging. Also, we know that the transgender people usually live in closed groups, which make the risk of transmission to the virus much more real for them as compared to the other groups. Again, with social discrimination, economic instability, absence of healthcare backup, their situation is also very, very critical. People with disabilities, we have a speaker who will share, but all the general challenges that we face, apart from that, they have special challenges, additional barriers, whether those are barriers related to communication, because definitely getting information is more difficult for people with vision problems or cognitive disabilities. They also find it difficult to adopt recommended public health strategies such as social distancing and washing hands because it is not feasible for certain categories of physical disabilities. Equitable access to healthcare is definitely a long-standing barrier for them. Their support system has suddenly stopped or has been largely curtailed. And, I don't know how these people are managing their life in this pandemic. People with visual impairment depend on touch, for most of their daily activities, even when the immediate crisis or the threat of the crisis is gone, it is going to be difficult because nobody will allow them, or very few people will allow them to hold their hands, in the new normal times. Students with disabilities being in universities, we know that they're facing a lot of pressure of accessing online classes, and they need uh, a lot of support if they have to keep up academically. So, what I'm trying to say is that there are distinct groups who are preordained to experience disproportionately higher vulnerability. And one more thing that we have to remember is that vulnerability and, the notion of vulnerability, the prevalence of vulnerability and vulnerable groups is changing. A person who was not considered vulnerable at the time of the onset of the pandemic can become vulnerable, also depending on policy response. For example, sudden loss of income or access to social support will have consequences that will be very difficult to estimate and constitute a challenge, because we don't even know who is facing these vulnerabilities eventually. For example, occupational groups, we all know, like, the hoteliers and the gym owners and the multiple occupational groups who have been impacted by an ongoing lockdown, they're also vulnerable. Many of these, establishments are facing the risk of permanent closures and loss of jobs. So the evidence-based trajectory of this pandemic demonstrates the power of privilege in the pandemic, indicating that while those with privileges will exhibit more resilience to tide over the crisis, those who are more vulnerable, we don't know, they will be the hardest hit. On top of that, you see, countries like India, we don't have very commensurate surveillance systems, health resources, and health infrastructure to respond in a manner that we can overcome these vulnerabilities. Also, it is important to note that, you see, there are systemic deficiencies as it is in preparing and planning for disasters, with profound health, economic, social, political, and humanitarian consequences. And so, it's important that whatever action plan we prepare takes into cognizance all these vulnerabilities. Globally, the coronavirus epidemic has laid bare the politics and the social inequities that contribute to elevated vulnerability among the socially and economically marginalized communities. We all know that the national governments, the civil society, and the entire international community is fighting this colossal crisis. Many policies and programs are there, but the risk of deepening inequalities has to be acknowledged. If the vulnerable groups are not properly identified, the consequences of the pandemic will be even more devastating. Just one or two more points. Number one, we need to have frameworks of vulnerability assessment. We have not been very good with evolving and measuring vulnerabilities. Vulnerability assessment needs to take into account individual factors, social parameters, economic factors, even an infrastructural assessment of where we are, an administrative assessment of what we have and what we don't have. Only that can give us a true understanding of, the present and the future vulnerability. We will have to look at changing the standard ways of treating the poor, especially the urban poor, create participatory governance, improve definitely an improvement in essential services, including healthcare, also investing new resources to ensure urban informal settlements benefiting in the long run. Another very important issue is fighting discrimination and stigma against the poor, against the migrants, and the lower castes and classes. It is high time that, we also look at community resilience, move forward from vulnerability to look at community resilience planning, because actually it is resilience which is the ability of the community to prepare for the hazard, this hazard and further anticipated hazards, adapt to changing conditions, withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. And so community resilience planning for the pandemic is extremely important, because we also need to see the post-pandemic realities on the ground and allow for backup measures, to because we have to stop future cascades. We have to halt future cascades of avoidable losses and despair. We will have to restore supply chains for food and energy security. All of these are, by no means simple. They will require a lot of time. Therefore, we need to also start now. um, what the advantage that we have is that we have a lot of national scale surveys. We have the National Family Health Survey, the annual health surveys, the comprehensive nutrition surveys, etc. And we can use them to prepare small area estimates for calibrating reliable models of community vulnerability and resilience. You see, because we will need to have a contextual approach. It can't be one model suiting all. Just my last point is that, you see, when it comes to disaster, we are all familiar with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, aimed at 2015 to 2030, which was adapted in March 2015 and supported by the United Nations. This framework has aimed at reducing disaster risk, but, you know, ironically speaking, it did not cover pandemics because we did not anticipate a pandemic of the nature of the coronavirus to come. And so this build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction has to now be configured in the context of the pandemic. And this gap has to be filled up by the national planning efforts. Otherwise, you see, the corona times or the post-corona times are likely to be very tough times. Thank you very much. This is all that I had to say. I think many more speakers are there over the 4 days. They will cover the vulnerable groups and also the action plans, the potential and the real action plans at in much greater depth. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was really, really comprehensive. And yeah, like any other disaster, the pandemic plus the different waves, the economic, the political, the social, the familial, altogether, the crisis is quite heavy on all the sections, especially the vulnerable session. Thank you for the session, ma'am.
Thank you.
Please hold on. Siddhappa, sir. I think there is a slight technical issue we have. Just please hold for a second. He'll be just switching back to the same link. Please hold on, everybody. So are we good to go?
Madam, sir, Madam, Nandini, Madam.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think sir is muted his mic. Can you just call and tell him?
Abhishek, sir?
Yeah, yeah, he is good.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Just a second. Sir, is the technical error corrected, sir? Siddhappa, sir? Can we go ahead with the session?
Yes, yes, please, ma'am. Please.
So once again, I request Priyanka to introduce our next speaker, Abhishek. Madam, over to you.
Good afternoon. On behalf of organizers of webinar, I take this opportunity to introduce and welcome our second speaker, Mr. Abhishek Thakur. Abhishek Thakur is currently teaching at Department of Social Work, University of Delhi. He graduated from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi. He is a recipient of gold medal during his post-graduation from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. He is a member of Task Force Committee, National Skill Development Corporation, Government of India. He is a member of Expert Committee on Disability Employment set up by the Government of Delhi. He is also a representative of Delhi government in Delhi Jal Board on identification of jobs for persons with disabilities. Delhi Jal Board. He has successfully completed various research projects on community based rehabilitation and sustainable livelihood framework. He has published on the topics like gender and disability, water and health, skill development, and so on. In this today's webinar, he will be talking on impact on disabled population. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes.
One
Okay,
second,
Nandini, am I
speaking,
audible?
Abhishek.
Yeah.
One second. I'll just give an instruction to the participants.
Okay.
Participants are requested refrain from posting any chats. You can post your queries after the session because our speaker is using a screen reader app and it will interfere with his speech. Please cooperate. Thank you, and over to you, Abhishek.
Thank you so much, Nandini. And I will be focusing on persons with disabilities and how the COVID-19 have impacted this particular section of the society. If we see the different frameworks of vulnerabilities given by different authors, we see that vulnerability is a degree in which certain population, individuals, and group are unable to predict, cope, uh, and resist and repair the impact of the disaster. If we see in a health context, the vulnerability is a susceptibility to the disease to the particular section of the society. Going by these two framework, if we locate persons with disabilities in these contexts, the situation is very difficult. One of the research I am currently doing on the impact of COVID-19 on the disabled population. So my talk will be based on the findings what I have received so far, talking to different categories of persons with disabilities. One is persons with disabilities are invisible population. And why we say them invisible? Because they are absent from the public policies, they are absent from public places, they are absent from the social discourse or policy discourse we have. Whenever we plan anything at the government level, at the local level, this particular section of the society is hardly considered because unfortunately we do not have any parliamentarian also who has disability in that sense. So what happens actually when this lockdown particularly was announced, a lot of personalities are uh, who are living independently or who are living alone, they definitely require a lot of services. For example, cooking is a very simple activity, but there may be many categories of persons with disability who may not be able to cook, and they were dependent on restaurants and other, service providers to provide them food. So when I started talking to the people, I have realized that they had faced a lot of difficulty even in getting food during this particular circumstances. Now, what happens? We all know that this is a crisis. The COVID-19 is a global crisis. We also have to understand that persons with disabilities are living always in the crisis. So this situation is a crisis within the crisis for this, for the PWDs, because they are always in the crisis, and now since the whole world is in crisis, their crisis is double fold. We all know that washing hand is a major activity which we all are supposed to do to prevent ourselves from the COVID-19 infection. Uh, and disability is a heterogeneous population. We have many categories of persons with disabilities, and some categories of disability people even may find it difficult to wash their hand regularly, which also makes them more vulnerable to getting infection. We do not have our public toilets, the tap system, everything is not very accessible for the people who are into wheelchairs. So thinking, keeping regularly washing hand and all becomes very difficult for this particular section. Uh, Another thing which we all are trying to practice is social distancing, which we should call it physical distancing, because we cannot be social distance. When the word comes social, a lot of social scientists has definitely opposed these terminologies or the term which was given by the government. But even if we consider physical distancing, there are persons with disabilities who are dependent on other to even though do a small task. And the reason is, it is not that they want to do the small task with the help of somebody, but the problem is we do not have an inclusive infrastructure. I stay in the campus, and my office is just 100 meter away from my home. And for many it may be a very great privilege that, okay, you stay so near. But I'll tell you, till from my office, my home gate till my office, there are 4 pits in the way. And for that, to avoid that, I have to take someone along with me to even to reach the to cover that 100-meter distance. So because of the lack of the infrastructure we have, our public spaces are not very inclusive. We have never developed the public spaces keeping in mind the diverse population, the elderly population, persons with disabilities, people with hinder impairment, medical conditions. So this particular situation makes it mandatory for this particular section of the society to seek for regular help. And now, in this context, the physical distancing is prevailing, and this particular section is going to face a lot of difficulties because everyone is viewed as a corona carrier. Then we have various guidelines started coming in. Lockdown guidelines have come up. No information which was provided by the government in the initial phase was accessible. We have people who are having print disabilities. We have people with hearing impairment. One of the hearing impairment person did not know that the lockdown has been announced, and he was roaming in the street and police tried to stop him. He could not hear. They have shot it in his leg. So because of his because lack of the information, he was not provided the information what he was supposed to get in a sign language or in a form or in a format which is accessible to him. He was not aware about the lockdown. Uh, so even we have a category called deaf blindness. They normally draw in your palm with the help of their finger to communicate what they are supposed to communicate to you. And in these circumstances, nobody is going to, offer their palm to understand what they want to say. So information became a very big hurdle or barrier in terms of accessing the right information for this particular section of the society. People with disabilities are also dependent on caregivers because some disabilities are so severe that they either have to visit to health centers or rehabilitation centers regularly, or somebody will rehabilitation worker will come and provide them services. This particular situation or lockdown has impacted because the caregiver was also reluctant to come and offer the services, and even though if he offers, the chances of bringing in infection from outside has increased for this particular section. We have seen thousands of people have walked on their foots from from Delhi to Bihar, from Odisha to Bengal. Uh, Definitely, the situation was very bad. They had to go through a lot of hardships in walking, so many kilometers on their foot. But there was a section of the society which did not even had this choice. No matter how much vulnerabilities, difficulties, issues, and challenges they are facing in the current place where they are staying, but they did not even had a choice to walk thousands of kilometers because of their impairment or their disabilities. Uh, we also have to understand that this particular section had asked for we have a pension system which was given by the government and which was anyway announced for all vulnerable population, but except 5 states, none of the states have or people with disabilities residing in those states have received any financial assistance. Even in Delhi, no persons with disabilities have received the financial assistance which was offered by the government during the lockdown phase. So this particular the challenges of this particular sections are double fold. They are already into crisis, and now the life has become more difficult for this section. And I think even though when we lift our lockdowns, even though when things becomes very normal, uh, this section will have a lot of issues and challenges because the education system we have immediately gone online. One of our student, she is having a speech impairment, and she reads lips when somebody talks, and that was not possible because even though the Google Meet and softwares provides a caption services, but those captions are not very much appropriate for person to make the sense what other is speaking. So even the children with disabilities, the immediately we have gone into online mode. There are softwares which are not very much accessible. The online video softwares are not very much accessible. The poverty and disability is also very much related to each other. We also have to understand that disability, either poverty creates disability or disability creates poverty. Because if you are poor, you must have not got proper healthcare services, proper nutritions. The chances of child born disabled is high. But even though if you are in a middle class and if a child born with disability, the chances of pushing that particular family into poverty is very high because the kind of expenditure, that the kind of cost is associated to manage disability. So this is also very important that they are, majority of them are poor, majority of them are vulnerable, and that the kind of policy discourse we have, the education system which we are planning must definitely take into the account their requirements and needs. Social isolation was not very difficult in these circumstances. The reason was because PWDs are anyway mostly socially isolated because they are having a habit of remaining mostly inside the home habit because of the kind of infrastructure which is not very accessible, so they are anyway not very much keen on venturing out. So that has not created any psychological impact. Only the services has impacted definitely them hard. So I think these are the few points I wanted to make, and the previous speaker, Professor Neera Agnimitra, has very well covered other sections of the society. So thank you. Over to you, Nandini.
Thank you, Abhishek. That was quite informative. A lot of times we have people around us who has different kinds of disability, and you don't really understand what their limitations are and how you can be, like helpful to them, or how you can assist them, and what are the challenges they face. So, like this talk of yours was also informative with regard to that. Thank you so much. So we can move to the question and answer sessions. So those who are logged in through Zoom can send your questions and queries to question and answer session and not in the chat box. And those who are on Facebook Live, YouTube Live, sorry, can actually post your questions there. I can read it out to the resource people. So yeah, welcome. Participants may.
And madam, there is a question from Chetana madam. Can I just read it?
Ma'am, you have provided a
I
comprehensive.
can read it. Can I read the question?
Yes.
Yeah, so there is a question asked of me. Ma'am, you have provided a comprehensive coverage of the vulnerable population. Thank you for that. My question, what are your views on COVID-19 and environmental vulnerability? So that's the question that I have. You see, as far as, again, it is how we are looking at environment, because for social scientists, environment is not just the natural and physical environment. You know, when we look at environment for us encompasses natural, physical, social, psychological. So all of those comprise the different components of this very holistic entity called the environment. But I'm sure, I think you're referring to the natural or the physical environment. You know, as far as the natural and physical environment is concerned, during the time of the lockdown, all of us know that it has done tremendous good to the environment. We all know that, you know, the only, what should I say, the only stressor to the natural and physical environment is no other species but the human species. And it is almost as if the planet has, you know, taken a revenge by shutting us inside our houses for some time, so that the planet can take a break. And we can all see very, very positive evidence of nature springing back. You know, at least in some measure, we see nature, we see, you know, animals, birds. It is almost as if they're having a free and field time while we are barricaded and imprisoned inside our houses. We see that the air has improved. We see that, you know, there is a lot of cleanliness all around. So in that sense, I think COVID has most certainly done a lot of good for the natural and physical environment. See, when we talk about environment, it is most of what is happening to the environment is anthropogenic, which means that it has been caused by human activity, that it is, you know, we as human beings who are causing the damage that we are causing. And you know, most of the disasters, we you know, we used to earlier categorize disasters as natural disasters and man-made disasters. Today, if you study disaster management, we perceive and we believe that all disasters are man-made, right? Because hazards are there, but man, or I shouldn't say man, but the presence of human beings triggers, it creates disasters out of hazards. So the anthropogenic influence of human beings is definitely, it has taken a lot of toll. I always say that the environment is like a rubber band. You know, it has a lot of resilience. You stretch it a little bit and you release it, it'll go back. You stretch it a little more, it can still go back. But you stretch it beyond a certain limit, it will snap. So we had already reached that situation where, you know, the point of no return had come. So in that sense, I think, you know, our experiences, although, you know, don't take me wrong, but I have a trust deficit when it comes to human beings. We are all learning a lot of great lessons. We are writing articles and books on what the COVID times are teaching us, but I am just waiting for the post COVID times to come, to see how many of us will really live on with, you know, the lessons that we have learned. Because as human beings, we have very short memories, and we are very likely to forget all the lessons that we have learned. So if we take the lessons learned to the future in terms of simple living, frugal living, slower pace of living, you know, the standards of sanitation, hygiene that we have maintained, the importance and significance of environment and clean environment, if we carry all those lessons forward, then I'm sure that the human beings and the planet will be better off. I hope that answers your question. Uh,
Hello.
yes.
Yeah, Abhishek sir. So you have questions, sir. Can you able to read it?
Yeah, can you just read it, please?
Yeah, sir. Sir, can you please share your good practice to work with disabled during lockdown situation? Is there any good practices that practicing now for
Oh,
disabled people?
yeah. We have to, as a society, first step we can take that, of course, we all have to follow the physical distancing and other COVID preventive measures. But as a society, we must at least keep asking them, if you know somebody is living, uh, at least keep in touch with them. If they have any specific requirement, they may request you, and then you can definitely try to help them out. For future, I think we must now definitely need a inclusive infrastructure, and which is not going to be happen overnight, because that will reduce the dependency of this section. Normal dependency, at least, uh, mobility related issues, going to the market, going to the school, going to college, going to office, using public transportations. If we create those inclusive infrastructure, uh, the dependency will be little less and they will be more independent. In current context, we definitely should try to speak to them and keep in touch, because there are a lot of groups who were staying together and suddenly the lockdown has happened. So I have received a call. Then we contacted different non-government organizations, and then they have arranged the food and everything. So this is how, if you keep in touch, you will realize what specific issues they are facing, and then you can address them immediately. Yeah.
If I may, I think I have also got another response from Chetna. She was referring to the natural environment, and her concern is with regard to the amount of biomedical waste that has been generated during this pandemic. Yes, most certainly, Chetna, we don't have a very good record as it is as far as waste disposal is concerned. Most of us know we didn't even know how to dispose of e-waste. And you see, like I always say, being a teacher of environmental action, I always say that, we have a tendency to externalize, to internalize the benefits or the profits and to externalize the costs. And we have a very poor record of waste disposal of different types. Hospitals also, the smaller hospitals across the country, in fact, in my neighborhood, we had a pathology lab being closed because there was a court case, and because they were disposing the blood and the other human matter samples most unjudiciously, and with no safety requirements. So that is a major concern. And unless we again have a lot of awareness generation on waste disposal, we are polluting our soil and our water and our air with all of these things, and infections are likely to increase. So definitely there is a concern about the proper disposal of biomedical waste in this crisis and even otherwise. And we definitely need a lot of training, a lot of strictness, a lot of penalties which should be imposed on the health staff, the municipal staff, and the hospitals if this is not done in a proper manner. So definitely the environmental vulnerability of dealing with waste and biomedical waste is very real. Then I have one more question, which has been asked by Dr. Prakash. And the question is on the COVID has more negative impact on migration laborers. What is your opinion about social security measures of this type of labor? Definitely, I have talked about that in my presentation, that India is home to a more informal sector, unorganized labor than organized labor. And there is need. You see, unfortunately, it's very easy for us to say that we are living in a time where there are human rights and there should be social security. But if you also look at the whole context, the huge population burden, the revenues, etc., it is definitely a very onerous responsibility on the part of any nation state, to provide an ongoing security to any category. But definitely there is a need to organize. At least there's a need to have a basic, if not organized properly, but at least a semi organized structure where basic rights to basic needs, food, shelter, basic social security, health insurance, that is assured. Steps are being taken by, but I think we need to do much more in order. Because you see, what is the importance of a crisis? Definitely a crisis like this is a very unfortunate event, very, very unfortunate event, and we could have done without it. But now that we have experienced it and we are experiencing it, unless we transform, unless we translate our insights and our lessons and our experiences into positive measures, into proactive measures, so that the future hazards do not create that much of vulnerability and impact, that is definitely, that should be the focus. Whether it is on the part of people like you and me, how we can campaign, how we can engage in policy building, how we can campaign in networking and trying to evolve newer ways of providing security. Because the suffering of the migrant workforce has been immense. And it is not something. And also we are living in a, because now that we've been told that we have to live with the coronavirus, that this is never going to go away, it's not even going to go away with the discovery of a vaccine, right? And which is also meaning that because of our anthropogenic interference with the larger, why did this infection come about? Because we are tampering with a lot of things where we should not have been tampering with. So it is only bringing home the fact that we are going to have more crises. We may have a corona crisis tomorrow, it may be a Verona crisis, but we are definitely now on the anvil of having a lot of the future hazards, which may turn into bigger disasters if we don't take lessons from this one. So social security, economic security, definitely for the unorganized constituencies, particularly this very vulnerable constituency of migrants, is important. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, ma'am. Now, there's yet another question from Dr. Tanuka Roy Sinha. And this is regarding okay, I guess the question is to Abhishek. Okay, it's about social disability. Social disability. So I think any of you can answer. During the space of physical distancing, what social work intervention is needed to remove social disability in the society? So I think the question is open to any of you.
So I think I'll try to answer it. Very, very good and very pertinent question you have asked. We have to constantly remove, one is the social barriers, as I have talked earlier. Then we also have to work on attitudinal and institutional barriers. Basically, the barriers are the one which creates disability, because if we see, disability is a functional limitation, and functional limitation, if you, and which is a range considered to be a normal. Suppose if I can walk 100 meter in 1 minute, so if somebody is not able to walk 100 meter in 15 minutes, so that is a range considered 1 minute is a range considered normal. So And this is because of other barriers, different barriers, and we do not have assistive technologies, and those are also very expensive. And so if we will keep removing, I won't say that we will be able to remove it 100%, because barriers are also keep coming in, but at least minimizing it. Suppose now when we are going into online mode and everything, we should, and suppose whenever we do something or we make any policy and we keep the most vulnerable in the front, then it becomes easy for others also. Jaise hum, when we are creating an educational policy for children, and if we keep in mind the children with disabilities or the most vulnerable children's, when we are creating an educational policy, then that particular policy will be more appropriate for even non-vulnerable children's. So this is how we have to, as a social work professionals, we have to keep reinforcing the notion that we have to keep remove the barriers and keep removing it, and make all policies, all plans as inclusive as possible, so that it will be more appropriate for everyone. Yeah.
I think
Neera
that
ma'am.
there is one more question from an anonymous person, that the persons with disability and aged people who are living in rural areas, they could not get essential needs such as health and food facilities during the lockdown. So how to tackle and handle this? I think that people in the rural areas were better off than people living in urban areas, because rural areas still has networks and a much richer social capital as compared to urban communities, where we find networks and social capital dwindling, right? So but nonetheless, in any context, you see, what we need is, again, the whole sense of community in the neoliberal times has diminished. We are living in times where it is I, me, myself, and this neoliberal capitalistic context is further marginalizing individuals from the larger networks, whether it is families. Now we are understanding the importance of families, we are understanding the importance of groups, we are understanding the importance of neighborhoods, because it is only in crisis period that we know who's helping and who's not helping, who's real capital and who's not capital. So in that sense, also as a teacher of community practice, I'd like to highlight that we need to get communities into our configuration. We need to revive communities of action. Whatever forms these communities take, whether they become very strong, consolidated RWAs in the communities or people based organizations, we have to harness and garner whatever they have to offer. They may be faith based organizations. So unless we do that, you see, because the government is not going to be everywhere, so in many ways, the sense of community, networks, coalitions, people based organizations have to step in order that, you see, we always knew that earlier communities used to have grain banks, communities used to have saja chula, so we need to again bring focus on those. We need to go back to the communities to see what were the systems of coping, what were the systems which provided resilience to people, and revive those. I think that is the only way in which every community in the remotest corner of the country can take care of its constituents.
Dr. Neera Agnimitra and Mr. Abhishek Thakur. It was a really nice session, and I apologize for any kind of inconveniences and incompetencies, because this is the first time we are hosting something like a webinar. So thank you so much. I would also take this opportunity to thank our respected principal, Prasanna Kumar sir, Dr. Prakash sir, who is our IQC coordinator, uh, all the colleagues who are here live and giving immense moral support. Today is actually a holiday here in the college, but we have all our ground staff running around, giving us the microphones and all these things. So I'm overwhelmed with the support of all the people. And finally, thanks so much to the participants here. We will be updating you soon regarding our next sessions. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you so